Thank you. That was fascinating, wasn't it, that last talk? I'm now distracted by the image of a fridge as a witness in a criminal case. As you see, I'm a jurist and a legal scholar. As Norman says, I've been somewhat involved in this project through the semester, not as much as I'd like to have been. I'm delighted to be invited, delighted to be back again to speak at this event. I always learn new things when I come to these conferences and interact with forensic scientists and statisticians, and today's no exception. It's been great. I'm delighted to be here. So my contribution, as you can anticipate, is somewhat from a more lawyer's perspective. Very quickly, I just want to start with some general context and background, fixed points that will provide a foundation for the substance of what I have to say. Just a reminder about the complexity of the institutional context in which we find ourselves in these discussions. And this slide, I really could talk for hours just about this one slide. Suffice it just to point out, for today's purposes, that there are at least 3 conversation partners in this discussion. It's not just lawyers and forensic scientists, but it's also statisticians too, and that's obvious to people in this audience, but it's worth underlining, because I do think lawyers sometimes fall into the habit of thinking there's us, the lawyers, and there's the others, the boffins. And the boffins are just one group of people, and if they're an expert, then obviously they know about stats, right? Well, so you can see already the potential for, let's say, expectations to be defeated in that kind of complex environment. And from the legal side of things as well, just to say that people in the room are familiar from their own disciplines with the complexity of statistics, and they're familiar with the complexity of forensic science. There are different kinds of forensic science. It's difficult to generalize in a reliable way about them. All of that applies to law as well in spades. So that's just something to bear in mind, that law itself is an incredibly complex set of institutions and practices and norms. And anybody who seeks to interact with that needs to take that on board at some level. People in legal discussions have been talking about the importance of statistics for about as long as H.G. Wells, we've heard of before. Americans and/or lawyers will be familiar with the name of Oliver Wendell Holmes, very influential individual, writing, and this is the key thing for today's purposes, in the 19th century, already saying that the man of the future is the man of statistics. All men then, of course, and we have moved on in some ways, perhaps not as much as some of us like to see. Point being, though, that here you have an eminent, prominent American jurist in the 19th century already talking about the importance of statistics. It's not a new thought. Here, much more recently, again, a figure that will be known to lawyers and most Americans as well, Richard Posner, judge and jurist, speaking about the skills that he believes are important for lawyers to acquire. First, lawyers ought to know the principles of statistical inference. And so it goes on. This, again, to emphasize, is a lawyer and a judge saying this, right? The particular link for me and for many other lawyers, because one of my areas is criminal procedure and evidence, is essentially expert evidence and the law and procedure surrounding expert evidence. In my case, I'm particularly interested in criminal adjudication and criminal procedure. Here we have a very esteemed comparative lawyer, Marianne Damashka at Yale, talking about the future of legal procedure. So to consider the future in the closing years of the 20th century is largely to talk about the creeping scientization of factual inquiry. And so it goes on. Again, emphasizing the importance of science and therefore of statistics and data in adjudication. I mean, whether you yourself would have put it in terms of creeping scientization, well, that's one way of describing it. You know, there can be different views about that, but you get the point. And again, to underline, this is a prominent jurist saying this, not a scientist, not a statistician, a lawyer, legal theorist. As most of you, I guess, know, but just to make sure everybody does, the discussion in forensic science over the last 10 or so years in particular has been around this idea of paradigm shift. There's an enormous amount bound up with this, but to cut a long story very, very short, the story goes that much of what was done in terms of traditional forensic sciences for the last 100 years wasn't science by the standards of normal scientific methodology. That's not to say it was hokum or totally unreliable or always a basis for miscarriage of justice or any nonsense like that. It's simply to say that for the most of the history of the modern forensic sciences, certainly within the English-speaking world, and I believe beyond that too, the evidence presented in court, its reliability and what you might say is epistemic foundation, its truth claims, were not scientifically demonstrable. And the paradigm shift, following on from what we learned from DNA profiling in the 1980s and 1990s, the paradigm shift is about making all those old forensic sciences actually scientific and demonstrably so. Making them have that quality means, amongst other things, them having a proper statistical empirical basis. And we've heard already lots of interesting information about the development of both new ways of thinking, Marianne talked about that, so did Dave, also new databases and the production of new data, moving from a paradigm where famous pathologists like Sir Bernard Spilsbury would stand up in court and say, yes, I can tell you when the time of death was. Well, how do you know, Sir Bernard? Because I'm an expert. What more need you know? You know, the oracular pronouncement of the expert saying, well, that's the answer, there you go, boffin has spoken. Now, whatever that is, that's not a scientific model, right? We're now moving to a process where there's a much more greater expectation that forensic science will conform to the methodological principles that apply to scientific endeavour in general. Good news for statisticians is you're more important than ever before. And again, so this slide, you don't need to know more than simply the title, really. From a faith-based science to a scientific science. That really encapsulates this notion of the paradigm shift that I'm talking about. Again, there's lots more could be said, but I'm conscious that Keith wants to go, so you know, I'll keep it short for now. Final slide here on this section really is just to underline the kind of things that Marianne was talking about in terms of Bayesian inference as one kind of technology, and let's call it that, a technology for thinking better, as being central to contemporary research and practice in forensic science. I would see that as being actually much of the glue that holds together otherwise very different kinds of subdisciplines within the forensic science world. Those reasoning methods are shared reasoning methods. They're an extrapolation of logic. And here you have the forensic science regulator in her report from last year talking about the provision of data to support the evaluation of evidential significance as a crucial task for forensic science today. So, education. We've already heard today about the importance of education in statistics and statistical inference for lawyers, amongst others. Here's David Kay writing 30 years ago about a report in the US. Instruction for law students in statistical methods or theory appears to be the exception rather than the norm in law schools. Turning to practice law, not statistics. goes on to emphasise the importance of statistical education for lawyers. Again, 1984. So, if you thought that the lack of progress in this regard was because no one's had the thought yet, or because lawyers haven't noticed, well, newsflash, 30 years ago, at least in an American context, they were already talking about the importance of this. Here's a British study. In fact, these authors were at my university, at least they were when they did the study, demonstrating, surprise, surprise, that lawyers are not very good and law students are not very good at manipulating statistical information or reasoning probabilistically. No, surprise, surprise. So, what's the problem? Can we diagnose what's going on? I'll come back to some of these ideas and work through them systematically, but the first one is something, you know, that is certainly not a unique property to lawyers. So all of you are familiar with the idea that there's so many people in the general population that just have this aversion to numbers. And in this regard, lawyers are just like the rest of humanity. And that's probably reflected in their choice of careers and so on and so on. No, I did this because people told me there'd be no math in it. Right? Again, Posner. Many law students claim to have, they even flaunt a math block. He calls it elsewhere a disgraceful math block. Again, this is something that's been noted about law students and lawyers and legal education more generally. So clearly, people have taken note that there is this issue. I'll say a bit more in a moment about work that I've been doing with Colin Aitken and Graham Jackson, and amongst others, and Colin Graham here today, as you know. But so far as this math block point is concerned, one thing that I've learned very clearly from working with Colin and Graham on these areas is, or it's simply come clear to me at any rate, is that it turns out it's not about the maths at all. The numbers, as Dave's talk nicely brought out, the numbers actually are just a computational issue, and you know there are issues about where you get your data and what quality it is. But in terms of computation, the software does that. I mean, come on, everyone's watch or calculator is a better computer than you are. I mean, that's not the issue. What's become very clear to me is that it's fundamentally about logic and rationality. Once you tell lawyers, amongst other people, that, there's no scope for any kind of response that says, oh, we don't do that. Because, you know, some lawyers might still say, and even flaunt the idea, says Posner, that we don't do maths here. But the idea that we don't do logic here, or we don't do rationality here, that's not going to fly amongst any education, any professional group. So once it's properly interpreted, forget the numbers, and this kind of comes back to what I was saying to Dave before lunch as well. Forget the numbers, because that's not really where the game is. The game is logical inference. And lawyers are supposed to be good at that. In other words, there is no excuse. Now, I've got a few things to say about the nature of legal education. I have to stress here that this is very much based on legal education in England and Wales specifically. There will be parallels with legal education in certainly other parts of the common law world, and perhaps beyond that as well. But it's terribly important for lawyers in a way that it isn't important for forensic scientists by and large in terms of their own disciplines, that jurisdiction defines what we do as lawyers. So what I've got to say is not generalisable. It's not safely generalisable. I'm going to talk about England and Wales. In my tradition, you know, I've been teaching law in university law schools for 24 years. A kind of doctrinalism is king in terms of the way that law students are taught. And by doctrinalism, I mean specifically and in summary, a concentration on the reported judgments of appeal courts. These form the core of what law students are taught. Now it's important to see that not only has that got nothing to do with statistics and forensic science by and large, it's not even got very much to do with the actual practice of law. You really have to get your head around that. Most legal practitioners, if they become legal practitioners, will be engaged in transactional work, it's not even litigation, or if they're engaged in litigation, it will tend to be first instance trials. Occasionally you'll go and do points on appeal if you're fortunate enough to get those kind of points, but that's not the bread and butter for most working lawyers day in, day out. So you've got to appreciate, if you're interested in engaging with this, that the model of legal education that we have in this country, and I think it is replicated elsewhere as well, but I'm talking about England and Wales, is one that's already quite abstracted from the reality of legal practice. Moreover, specifically procedure and evidence are even further marginalised within legal education. You have to know about England and Wales that currently, and since the 60s, legal education has been split into two phases, the academic phase and the vocational phase. At the academic phase, which is a stage, which is what research-led universities like mine are involved in, we really concentrate on teaching law as a liberal arts degree. Now, it's not taught specifically to train practitioners per se. It's meant to be a general intellectual foundation in law as a social phenomenon. Talk about legislation and the political context of that, and so on and so on. Now, again, you have to be careful here because it's very different in the US. In the US, law is already a graduate degree. The JD is a graduate degree. So everyone that does the JD in the US, they've already done something else as a first degree anyway. And some of those people will have done science and even statistics. So from that point of view, the situation is kind of even worse than David Kay was talking about for the US 30 years ago when he was referring to the US, because in my jurisdiction, we're taking 18-year-olds, most of whom, you know, will not have done any maths or stats to any kind of high level. They've got GCSE or whatever, but beyond that, nothing. Now, just to really drive this home, in this jurisdiction, at the academic stage of legal education, the law of evidence is not a required subject. I teach the law of evidence, and I teach my course as criminal evidence. There's a whole reason why I do that, which I can't go into now. But suffice it to say that only about 20% of Nottingham law graduates do any evidence law as part of their undergraduate LLB degree. The implication of that, just to make this very graphic for you, the implication of that is that most of our graduates don't know properly what the presumption of innocence is. These are law graduates. By the way, I believe that most people don't know properly what the presumption of innocence is, and I've got a whole different shtick on that, not for today. But in any event, what I'm trying to say to you is that you come to this and you say, well, there are good arguments for them knowing about maths and stats, and I say, sure, there are good arguments for them knowing about maths and stats. But there are also good arguments for them knowing about the presumption of innocence. And if I had to choose, I'd be teaching them about the presumption of innocence. You get my point? I mentioned that we're not actually, in my university, teaching lawyers as our ambition. We are teaching law as an intellectual enterprise. They then go on to the professional practice afterwards. So there's an issue there about what law schools should be doing, because you know you should probably talk to them about what they think they're doing before you say what they should be doing. So this goes to these points. So curriculum overload. This is, building on what I've already just said, whenever anybody suggests teaching something additional in the current law degree, the immediate response will be, that's fine, what are we going to take out? All right? So it's no good simply to say, wouldn't it be a good idea if lawyers got taught about this stuff? Because then you need to say, and by the way, they don't need to be taught about this and that. I completely admit, I could concede, that this is a question of priorities. So when people talk about curriculum overload, they don't literally mean there is no room for a foundation in statistical inference. What they mean is we're not prepared to make that room relative to what we'd have to junk in order to get that in. So the message there is, even if you've got very good intellectual reasons for integrating statistical inference into lawyers' education, the in-principle argument is not enough, because it's going to run up against very real pragmatic concerns just about how you would find the room. And then those other things, it was basically a lack of material and lack of skills. I mean, the answer to those things is, of course, to train the teachers and provide the materials. And I'm hoping that people in this room will be helping to address those deficits that exist at the moment. So none of this is to say it can't be done. My emphasis is very much on the reality of the challenge. If you're serious about integrating this kind of education into lawyers' training, you really have to consider these pragmatic constraints and obstacles. So it's all very well moaning about, how difficult it is to do. What can we then say about practical initiatives? I want to start off with this point. There are different kinds of models of intervention. I mentioned 3 possible ways of distinguishing the materials that are being provided in recent years. An education model, a self-regulation model, and a legal authority model. These are not institutionally hermetically sealed off. They can interact in interesting ways. One question for the principles that Norman introduced this morning is, how would you see that fitting in with this kind of framework? What is it you're trying to do? Because what I really would say, once you've got that clear in your mind, you probably should say that's what it's for on the document itself, because I think that will help consumers of that document understand exactly what it's for. I would also add that as regards the practitioner guides, to my knowledge, and Graham and Colin are here, they'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, but we never described them or presented them or intended them as guidelines. They are guidance. And that's a slight terminological difference, but the intent behind that is significant. Certainly as far as I'm concerned, and Colin and Graham will correct me, what we were doing with these materials was trying to educate people about how they might usefully think about these issues. Not to say to people, you should do it in this particular way, but something like, if you do this, there are these reasons why that might be problematic, and you think about it about this. So what we were doing, in other words, as far as I'm concerned, was non-directive. It was facilitative and educational. Well, that's one model. Other models, have more, if you like, normative bite. So I'll say a little bit more now about the RSS materials. Just very quickly, some of you know this already, it all came about in particular following the Sally Clark case. The then President of the Royal Statistical Society wrote to the Lord Chancellor to express concern about the way in which statistical information had been used in the Clark case. You don't need to read through it, you get the idea. We could have an interesting discussion about the extent to which statistical information actually had a bearing on the verdict in Clark. That's perhaps for another day. I'll just mention that. And I now come on to the 4 RSS reports. This is the work that we did. Colin Aitken at Edinburgh, Graham Jackson at Abertay, and we had quite a bit of help from various other people as well. There are 4 helpfully colour-coded RSS manuals. Colin tells me that at least 2, 3 and 4 are available for free, by the way, for free in the vestibule. We're in coffee time. We're very keen to get feedback on these. We very much regard it as work in progress in the way that other documents have been described, so we're very much open to feedback. We want to know whether they're useful and how you use them, if you did, how we can improve them. In short, well, you can read the titles. The first one's a general introduction. Norman mentioned that this morning. The second one is more specifically about DNA stats, particularly for complex mixtures, and we had a lot of help there from Roberto Pucsolis and Sue Pope. Number 3, Colin thinks of this as the BayesNet report. I think of it as the Wigmore chart report. It doesn't matter how informally you think of it, because what we're really doing there is laying much of the basic logical groundwork that, for example, Dave highlighted in his presentation. Because, as Dave brought out, and others are very clear in the room, even though BayesNet sounds as though it's all to do with maths and calculation and probabilities, it's actually fundamentally about logic. And there are different other kinds of logical inference framework that you can draw on to help you make those relationships clearer. And we go through all that in that report. And then in the last one, which Graham Jackson led on, that's a more specifically applied account of some of these general principles, tackling case assessment and interpretation in forensic science. So again, hopefully those are useful. They're there free to download from the internet, and some copies outside. I should say that I guess there's about 400 pages of material there. More than that, says Colin, 500. Well, whatever it is. It's not a back of envelope piece of work. There you can see, you can download it from the internet. It took us a long time to do, and it wasn't easy. You know, go back to my first slide with the 3 groups, the lawyer, the statistician, the forensic scientist. We kind of embodied those roles in our interactions, and we had many, many long, fruitful discussions telling each other how we'd all got it wrong. It took a long time to draft out that material. We're all still friends, it worked out, but it's tricky to do that kind of interdisciplinary work, which is a lesson in itself. The MC guideline is a different beast because it's directive. If you read what it says, you know, this is how it should be done. You should do it this way. I'm not against that per se. I'm just saying that's a different kind of approach to what we were attempting to do. And then finally, we have the work that Neve and other people are working on, in particular, the Lord Chief Justice is keen on this, the idea of the primers for particular areas of forensic science. You see the Law Society Gazette distinguished itself with its headline there, Boffins offer primers for courtroom science. I'll just say, I mean, again, I'm all for all of these kinds of initiatives. I think it's going to be hard work. I think it's going to be very tough. Imagine having to distill agreed information in an authoritative form. This is a really tough challenge. And when you read the reports, as reported in the kind of press about this, you know, oh yes, the Boffins will get together, they'll write a document, and then the courts will apply it, and it'll stop argument in the courts. Well, I'm sorry, I don't believe a word of it. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. But part of this is to do with the inherent controversy of these topics. Don't necessarily think you can. And to a certain extent, I'm not sure that you should close down legitimate debate within the context of litigation. But there's, on one view, you're effectively taking, you're inviting trial judges on one view to treat these documents as a source of judicial notice about scientific facts. And I understand the impetus and desirability for that, but there are clearly dangers there as well. You know, so I think let's watch this space around that, and I'm certainly will be watching developments there with great interest myself. So let me just sum up, because I'm aware of time. It's already been said that education in this field must be at least, I mean, a 3-way street, 4-way street. We've all got things to learn, is the bottom line. It's not simply about statisticians coming along and telling lawyers how they are just dumb or don't understand stuff, and if only you just did what we said, everything would be fine. Quite apart from that, I can tell you that that will be a fundamentally inept strategy for engaging with lawyers, because they'll send you away with a flea in your ear, basically, because their response will be, it's you that's ignorant, you don't understand law and legal process. And of course there's truth on both sides of that discussion, but the only way forward is a productive, sensible, respectful, interdisciplinary conversation. It's not one group telling the other what to do, because that's not going to get us anywhere. Interdisciplinarity is absolutely crucial, but it's hard. It's hard because we don't just have disciplinary knowledge that we share with one another. Like, I give you the law bit, Colin gives me the stats, Graham gives me the forensic science, and we go along with a big basket of knowledge and it's all fine. The reality is that our disciplinary perspectives affect the way that we view the world. They affect our language, our terminology. They affect what we regard as a problem that needs solving. Interdisciplinarity goes right to the root of these conversations. This is not a bad news story. We need to try harder, we can make progress, but don't expect it to be easy. It's tough work to do this. Don't underestimate pragmatic obstacles. It's not just about in-principle arguments. Details matter. Lawyers care a lot about details. Think about what kind of intervention you're making in a particular document. And we are in here the business of transformation of cultures, institutionally embedded cultures. As I've shown at the beginning of my presentation today, the problem has been identified for a long time in law, in legal scholarship. Making progress is going to be a long job. So I find myself in it for the long haul. I've been working on this topic, expert evidence in general, for longer than I've been an academic. And I hope that many people in this room are in it for the long haul as well. And I look forward to working with you in a productive, collaborative manner going forward. Thanks very much.